Thank you, John, and welcome everybody. For those of you for which this might be your first time coming to a task seminar webinar, welcome, and also to those that are familiar and regular members of the network as well. It's lovely to see you all again. So we're going to be going through until 6 o'clock for tonight's seminar. There will be plenty of opportunity and space for a Q&A after Tarek has presented. I'll introduce you to him in a moment, but what I quickly do want to mention though is after at 6 o'clock after this hour's webinar, we do have our 25-minute community meeting after this hour. So at 6 o'clock, we're going to be drawing the webinar part to a close. We then take a 5-minute break, and then we come back from 5 past 6 to 6:30 for our community meeting. So if you are able to stay on for that community meeting, please do. But without further ado, and more importantly, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Tarek Younis. Dr. Younis is the racial justice researcher at Healing Justice London and senior lecturer in psychology at Middlesex University. He researches and writes on Islamophobia, racism and mental health, the securitization of clinical settings, and the politics of psychology. He teaches on the impact of culture, religion, globalization, and security policies on mental health. As a registered clinical psychologist, he primarily attends to experiences of racism, Islamophobia, and state violence in his private practice. His book is called The Muslim State and Mind, Psychology in Times of Islamophobia, and it gives me absolute pleasure to hand over to Dr. Tarek Younis.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the whole team for inviting me. Thank you, Myra, in particular, someone whose work I've followed for a long time, who I think also I want to just also acknowledge as someone who's been a big supporter of my own work also for many years. I'd like to also give a shout out specifically to Myra. She just recently published a book, Working Within Diversity, which is speaking to sort of the anti-oppressive practices, which is really the theme of this talk as well. I'll go ahead and just share my my slides, but I want to give that shout out just so that you all just check out Myra's book as well. So today, I feel very fortunate and obviously with a heavy heart to be speaking about a little bit of what I would say is some clamor, some confusion, some issues we have with anti-racism in mental health. Okay, today that is the main theme of today. To think through anti-racism beyond bad apples, beyond individuals, and to understand it within forms of institutional racism. And this has been the main theme of my work for many years now. And I will, I'll be speaking today to this in a context that I think we're all sort of bringing in also into this room with regards to Palestine in a bit. But obviously I would like to also begin by acknowledging our daughter Hind, someone I've begun every single talk, everything that I do is in memory of her. And I want to be very clear, this isn't performative. This is central to the subject that we're going to have at hand here. Hind is a 6-year-old girl. She was traveling with her family in a van or a vehicle that was shot up by the IDF. She herself and her older sister were the survivors of that attack. Her older sister was able to call the Red Crescent and request, under very dire pain and suffocating circumstances, for an ambulance to come pick them up. While the ambulance was on its way, unfortunately, Hind's older sister passed away, and Hind was left alone in the van, waiting for the ambulance to come. As the ambulance approached, Israel then shelled the ambulance. The ambulance and its the drivers were killed immediately. And Hind was left to die alone suffering while the whole world bore witness to her situation. The reason why this is not performative, and the reason I am highlighting this, is because the significance of my own work on state violence is qualitatively different than other forms of violence. When we think about state violence and the way it becomes institutionalized within policies, within public consciousness, we see the various ways in which these forms of dehumanization escalate and create these chain effects whereby a certain individual gets impacted on many different ways in many different levels, right? It's not just not a single incident that affected Hind. It was a series of events that affected Hind. And I'm going to be speaking to this idea of state violence. And to be clear, Myra gave a really fantastic introduction to myself. To give just maybe just an addendum to this, I've been working with people affected and impacted by state violence for many years. And we recently launched last year a project called Coming Home for anyone impacted by police violence, security, border policing, or anything else. This has been a main subject of mine for a long time. So how do we understand the significance of Palestine in our context today? Sort of requires us to have an understanding of the process of racialization. And I'm going to just introduce some contemporary and significant examples of how Muslims are racialized. So when I speak about institutional racism, I need to emphasize that I will be focusing on Muslims. For anyone who's heard me speak before, you would have heard these examples before. It's only maybe about halfway through or near the end where I'm going to start bringing other newer material. But the first example is that of a racialized Muslim woman. She went to see a therapist in the NHS for trauma. And she wears a niqab, which is a face covering that reveals the eyes. And the therapist told her in the very first session that one of the signs of successful treatment will be her ability to remove her niqab in public. Okay, let's hold on to this. The second is that of a racialized Muslim staff member in the NHS. I should introduce the prevent policy. I'll be speaking about that quite a bit because one of the reasons, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from here. I'm from Canada, but I came to the UK under a British Academy fellowship, looking at the prevent policy and the way it's implemented in the NHS. So a lot of this research are things that I published on, and you can access quite easily. This is example of a racialized Muslim staff member in the NHS who received a phone call from a psychologist. The psychologist had a patient come in, and the patient was wearing a kufi, which is this head garb that some Muslim men might wear. And the psychologist asked, "Is this a prevent referral?" Now, prevent is a policy in the NHS. Many of you might be aware of it. It's in all public bodies. It's a duty upon institutions to train their staff to refer individuals they suspect might become terrorists in the future. So as the Home Office themselves admit to, this operates within what Tom Cruise would love to hear, the pre-criminal space. I'm referring to Tom Cruise because there's a movie called Minority Report, which is a fictionalized narrative on the idea of pre-crime. So it operates within the pre-criminal space, trying to ascertain if the person in front of me could potentially become a threat to national security in the future. The racialized Muslim chaplain responded by saying, "Well, that's funny. I'm wearing a kufi as well." And the last case I'm going to talk about in the process and on our understanding of racialization is that actually of a white GP who told me about a patient who came in. He's wearing a long garb. He has a big beard. And they were chit-chatting, and she's known this patient for a long time. And the patient at one point admitted that, "You know what? I've been thinking about homeschooling my children." And all of a sudden, The GP froze, and she admitted to me that she was just suddenly overwhelmed, inundated with so many different thoughts that were suddenly intruding into the conversation. She was wondering if this idea of, or this, this idea that this man had of homeschooling his children was worthy of a prevent referral or not. And she suddenly decided to stop asking any questions and sort of withheld engaging in the conversation anymore. Now, I'm going to unpack all these cases because, as you could tell, these cases sort of reveal different facets. And when we speak about racism and racialization, we tend to compact our understanding of racism in ways that takes away a lot from the nuances in the way it operates. And I'm going to be speaking to that right now. So obviously, this speaks to the idea of racialization that we need to begin with, and not just racism. The idea of racialization, first, we need to kind of distinguish between illiberal and liberal forms of racism. Okay, illiberal racism is a sort of racism that everyone here, we have 92 people in the room, we'd all kind of raise our hand if we were asked, do we hate racism? Are we anti-racist, right? The illiberal racism is a sort of wholesale hatred, demonization for entire groups. So saying, I hate all Black people, I hate all Jews, I hate all Muslims, whatever it might be. It's what we understand as the sort of traditional form of racism. Liberal racism is far more significant. And if you follow actually the research and writings on racism, you'll come to see that the liberal forms of racism is actually those that are most pertinent. Liberal racism takes place especially in societies that consider themselves post-racial. And post-racial, in a sense, speaks to this understanding, this commonsensical understanding that we no longer live in a society where it's governed by race. There's no apartheid here. There's no racial segregation. So the structures of society are no longer demarcated by race. So that's what's the idea of the post-racial. So liberal racism then entails not a wholesale demonization of groups, but what we see today quite significantly is this sort of indexing of groups according to racialized logics like migration, terrorism, etc. It creates these good and bad dynamics. So there's good migrants that benefit society and bad migrants who are leeches on society. There's good Muslims, like George Bush put it, you're either with us or against us. There's either good Muslims on the side of the war on terror or bad Muslims on the other side. Good Black people, bad Black people, etc. Right? So it operates within groups. And the important here for all of us who are mental health professionals or psychologists is to understand how the significance of race gets abstracted in these attempts to govern and to enact these policies. See, the idea of immigration, counterterrorism, gangs, etc., these are all highly racialized constructs. So in a way, in a liberal society, what has to be done is kind of abstract the race in this. And colorblindness is a really significant idea of how we try to erase the importance of race when it matters. So in counterterrorism, race matters, but there's ways of erasing the significance of that. In stop and search policies for police in London, a Black youth is 30 times more likely than a white youth to be stopped and searched by the police. But the police will never say we're out to get Black youth, right? So there's this abstraction of, okay, how is race abstracted from their policies? This is really important to be able to move forward. So what's going on is that, and this is the importance of racialization, is that groups are racialized according to dominant ideologies and particular social conflicts. What I mean by that is dominant ideology like nationalism, that's been discussed at length. Nationalism, this idea of who is British, who's German, who's Danish, right? This idea of nationalism is inherently racialized. Hannah Arendt famously said about World War II Germany that the nation killed the state. the nation killed the state, because this idea of the nation, of who belongs to Germany, killed the entire sort of state governing apparatus, right? Nationalism is one of the dominant ideologies we're seeing increase across the global north, but particular social conflicts, like I mentioned, the war on terror, illegal or undocumented migration, gangs, and so many other things. These are also highly racialized, right? And so the process of racialization is contingent on space and time, right? To what that dominant ideology, what the social conflicts of society are at that time that end up be giving so much time and weight. What's important here, as you could tell right now, what I'm really speaking against is this idea of racism as this virus, this fringe hatred that's sort of growing on you know, the outskirts of society, or the psychologized prejudice. There's something about the process of racialization that's significant in all of society. Now, obviously, the main point that always comes back to me is, Tarek, how can Muslims be racialized? You know, Muslims are not a race. They come in all these different shapes and colors. How does that even make sense? Now, the response to that is actually not very difficult. I often, and I'll try to share this story. This story is really important. It often takes up too much time, but I'm trying over time to condense it within a minute. Right post 9/11, there was a mosque, or there is a mosque that's not far from Ground Zero. That mosque has always existed there, okay? It's a mosque that's sort of in the basement, in a building not far from Ground Zero, and they wanted to renovate. They wanted to renovate the mosque. By wanting to renovate, they brought the public's attention on them, right? So the public suddenly realized, oh, there's this mosque next to the sacredness of Ground Zero, and suddenly people were appalled, and they started organizing protests against the existence of this mosque. So now suddenly there's ostensibly only white people going out on the streets, being very, very opposed to the existence of this mosque. Except for two people who wanted to join. These two people who wanted to join the protest against the mosque were Coptic Egyptian Christians. And if you don't know what a Coptic Egyptian Christian might look like, you can look at me. Just for reference, I'm Egyptian as well. So they might look something like me. And they showed up at this protest against the mosque. And when they showed up, they got their butts kicked by everyone in attendance at this protest, because what? They were racialized as Muslim. And you have to understand this point when it comes to the process of racialization. The process of racialization does not care, it's irrelevant how you self-identify, right? They might not self-identify as Muslim, but they were racialized as Muslim. And there's a lot of other research to demonstrate how Sikhs are attacked on the street, for example, because they're racialized as Muslim, right? And I've heard also of obviously other South Asians, things like that, right? So the process of racialization or self-identification is actually irrelevant to the process of racialization. And that's actually one of the biggest issues we have with identity politics, is because it makes us overlook how racialization operates in society. Now, Muslims are racialized according to many different logics. I already mentioned nationalism. Nationalism is inherently just sort of that question. If you just look at me or anyone who's not white, that question that comes up, well, where are you actually from, right? So many racialized Muslim Muslim groups come from racialized non-white, obviously, backgrounds. And so they're just their bodies alone, just because they're racialized not as white, you know, obviously plays a role in their racialization as an other. There's also obviously imperialism and the long history of Western civilizational superiority of its values in opposition to Muslim lands. You know, the Iraq War was famously justified on liberating Muslim women from the regressive and cultural environments. And in this, the hijab and the niqab and other things like that have become very significant racialized signifiers, especially here in the global north, which have always become these sort of arenas of contestation to sort of see how much we can really enact our liberal values You know, is hijab oppressive or not oppressive? These are the sort of discussions that just keep coming up. And there's a history to that. Like my whole point, what I'm trying to explain is there's histories to all understandings of racialization. The war on terror famously, of course, racialized any sort of embodiment of religious practice, beard, putting on the headscarf as well. And it benefits, of course, the military industrial complex. So these are just samples of trying to understand how Muslims are racialized and the different ways they're racialized. So that means a white Muslim can still be racialized as Muslim if the signifiers are present in terms of their Muslimness, right? So they may not embody the point of nationalism, but they might embody it elsewhere. And actually, converts play a very interesting role in all this. I'm going to be emphasizing terrorism a lot, so I'm just going to forget the top. I'm going to ignore the top part. It's actually the bottom part because it's specifically significant to Palestine. One of the ways, obviously, Muslims are racialized that we know very well at this point is they're racialized to threat to national security, to violence, etc. And what's very significant is trying to make sense of this process of racialization. There was a great study that was done a couple of years ago. It was done in Germany, but I would say ostensibly it also generalizes very well to the UK and to other contexts, where they tried to make sense of where does the fear of terrorism come from in public? And the assumption is that people might fear terrorism the same way they fear crime, right? You fear something happening to you, to your loved ones. But they found that the fear of terrorism was actually far more correlated with negative attitudes towards Muslims. So the idea of terrorism and the actually construction of it, the industry and the discipline of counterterrorism had and always has and always had Muslims and Palestinians directly embedded within its construction. So much so, actually, contemporary counterterrorism, the discipline, there's a fantastic book called Disciplining Terror by Lisa Stampnitzky, who charts the history and development of counterterrorism, modern contemporary counterterrorism. And Israel actually played a very central role in the development of contemporary counterterrorism. And she gives examples already from the 70s, I think, or 80s, whereby any attack on Palestinians, any attack on Israeli soil or on Israelis was immediately sort of calculated within this algorithm, within this calculus of terrorism, right? So they were establishing a database, but any attack on Palestinian soil or on Palestinians was never included, right? So they're developing this database, which creates this construction of where and who terrorists are. And you actually if you pay attention to the rhetoric of the justifications that we're seeing for the genocide today, you'll see that terrorism remains so central. And there's a lot about the dehumanization that has come through counterterrorism, which I'm going to speak to. So I'll just quickly give these examples and elaborate them. I'll try to do it within a minute because I feel like I'm actually going way over time. So for each example, very quickly, the racialized Muslim woman who is told to take off her niqab. I mean, we already see this discourse of liberation, right? So actually what's really significant here is also this disrupts our understanding of racism as something that's somehow inherently infused with violence, with threat, with abuse. Here, imagine the therapist was smiling, right? I mean, Malcolm X famously made the distinction between wolves and foxes when it comes to racists. Wolves are those who come and charge at you and they're angry, and we see that maybe with far right or whatever, right? They're just angrily shouting out. Whereas foxes invite you in, right? They smile at you. And this is Malcolm X's point, is that there's something about liberal forms of racism which don't explicitly entail some element of abuse. So here, this idea of the public consciousness of liberating this Muslim woman from her environment, from her practice, is very clear, and it sort of enters into the common sense of therapy for the idea of the therapeutic intervention, that this is a successful way of determining if therapy went well or not. The racialized Muslim staff member kind of speaks to the banality of racialization, just as kufi, but also that when we think about anti-racism, it's not just about the professional to the patient, it speaks to the institutions, right? So the idea of prevent is something that inherently, the moment it becomes a policy within an institution, it creates a racialized logic within the entire institution. It's within the four walls. It's not this staff member. It impacts everyone within the walls. And that actually speaks to the white GP. And this is really important because she's someone who then became a friend. And we spoke about this case at length. And she was really, really quite honest with me about how she just really hated that she suddenly thought about prevent. And I wrote about this case at length because I would assume most people don't understand why she thought about counterterrorism when a racialized Muslim man with a long garb and a big beard is talking about homeschooling. Right? This is something that intuitively people don't understand, which speaks to the fact that we actually are not understanding and appreciating history when it comes to racialization, because history and context is so important. So I'm going to just try to explain it very quickly. The significance of homeschooling can be understood actually within the wider discussion what Ann Norton calls the Muslim question. Muslims in the global north have long been sort of questioned about their ability to integrate into liberal societies, right? That's what's posed as the Muslim question, which always puts them sort of on the boundaries of belongingness to Western societies. What used to be pre-9/11, like pre-war on terror, what's really famously sort of, or infamously sort of like, I'm remembering them as like these integration debates. Can Muslims integrate into Western society, right? And what used to be then sort of the maybe the more banal way of saying it in discourse would be, you know, Muslims, you either integrate into a society or get the hell out, right? Integrate into our values or go back to the country where you're from. What the war on terror effectively did is that it securitized long-standing integration discourse. So what was either integrate into our society or get the hell out suddenly became either integrate into our society or you're a potential security threat, right? So this idea of integration, and that's why prevent, the way it was introduced in schools, has to do with what? Fundamental British values, right? So this idea of Britishness and integrating into British values suddenly became securitized. And so that's where it came from. But what I find really significant about this case is also how she's kind of recognized that, but she felt suffocated. So there was this way in which this racialized policy immediately impacted the intersubjective space between the therapist and here in this case, the doctor and the patient. And she just held her mouth. And the patient didn't even know that this is happening, right? But this was a highly racist sort of, or racialized experience that the patient wasn't even made aware of. But it speaks to what? It speaks again to the four walls. It speaks to the ways in which policies become embedded and they inherently racialize certain people. And they immediately then impact every element of intersubjective relations and experiences. So much so, and this is why it's really important, it speaks also to the thresholds. How do we understand the qualitative nature of this racialized experience, right? It doesn't show up in statistics because she didn't say anything. She didn't say anything to him at all, right? But it had an impact on the space itself. So we have become also one of the, in the nature of this talk, of the sort of confusion and clamor and the sort of what I would say is this muddling of anti-racism that we have in psychology and mental health and health in general, is that we're not appreciating these qualitative experiences because of our emphasis so much on, you know, very overt and clear examples of abuse and other things. So mental health and psychology plays a really big role in sort of maintaining racist policies. One of the ways in which that happens is what I call this performative colorblindness. So it's sort of very clearly erasing the significance of race when it matters. Remember, The baseline point I'm trying to say here is that terrorism and threat to national security is racialized to Muslims. And if anybody wants in the Q&A, if they'd like to invite me to explain, well, what does it mean then if white people and the far right are then included, or other groups, I can elaborate on that. But that doesn't take away from this point that threat to national security and violence is racialized to Muslims. So in prevent training, you'll get these slides like this. What factors might make a child vulnerable to radicalization? Then you'll see deprivation, bullying, attending the local mosque, adolescence. And you're not supposed to click attending the local mosque, which kind of speaks to this point of what the people who created this training understand, is that in public consciousness, people will associate normatively this point between radicalization and Muslimness. And what they're doing here is that they're raising a racialized signifier and erasing it. So they're saying, is it a boy attending local mosque? No, no, no. Is it a woman putting on a headscarf? No. Is it a man growing a beard? No. But by doing so, they're actually reifying that this is the relationship between these two constructs in public consciousness, right? And this is sort of this raising and erasing of race actually is a very sort of banal and very clear, very clearly sort of messy anti-racism, right? It is racism, obviously. I should mention this picture wasn't from me. This picture was from a psychiatrist who sent me this. He took the picture of the prevent training. He put the red arrow there, and he was just infuriated that this was here. I think for the sake of time, I'm going to just try to focus on 3-4 more slides. I have others, but I want to bring home a very particular point for all psychologists and mental health professionals here. And something I'm speaking about much more widely, about one of the ways in which psychology and mental health in particular has a very interesting way of dismissing the significance of race when it matters. And one of those ways we see very clearly in prevent training is this psychologization, right? It's this idea of saying, well, anybody in this room, including myself, can become terrorists in the future if we are psychologically vulnerable enough, right? We all in our shared human configuration, if any of us become psychologically vulnerable enough, any one of us can become radicalized, right? And so there's this deep and profound psychologization of counterterrorism and counter-extremism, which emphasizes this idea of psychological vulnerabilities. And in doing so, it's flattening it, right? It's saying we all, based on our shared human vulnerabilities and our understanding of especially Eurocentric psychology, any of us can become terrorists in the future. I'm going to skip this slide. Now, to bring in more concretely why that matters for Palestine is because prevent long has been a focus, or Palestine has long been a focus of the prevent policy, not only in examples in healthcare, which I know of, but I don't have the clearance to be able to share examples of, but there are public examples, like this example of Rahman Mohammadi years ago, who wanted to organize an event on Palestine at a school. The police warned him not to talk about Palestine, and they further claimed that staff members had approached his 14-year-old brother and pressured him to tell Rahman to stop being radical. Now, as someone, I just want to mention, these police interactions are often, I think, understated. Not often, they're always understated. They're always incredible experiences of violence. And I know this because these are the people I exclusively work with. Whenever a police officer comes to you and says, stop being so political, especially, let's say, about Palestine, this is incredibly violent, but it occurs within the rubric, within the logics of prevent. Because prevent ostensibly is about trying to manage ideal ways of political thinking. And support for Palestine has often and actually historically always been one that's incredibly managed and silenced. I'll speak to these two. So I'm sorry, Myra, I probably I think I'm going to go a couple more minutes over time, yeah? Okay, great. So there is a reason why this matters so much. So maybe for something that people don't know. In fact, I assume anyone who hasn't heard me before probably doesn't know this. The NHS and the police have developed an unprecedented relationship in British history. They're developing and they're going to be rolling out these vulnerability support hubs, these mental health hubs. Remember when I spoke about the racism of prevent? Now there's this idea, this emphasis that maybe if they sort of psychologize it completely and make it all about mental health support, that sort of will remedy any situation about pre-crime. And we found through, and by we I mean Hill Aked of MedAct, who did fantastic work, FOI'd the police, got all these police documents of these undercover vulnerability support hubs. And they found that racialized Muslim youth, so the majority of people being referred to these mental health hubs, remember, pre-criminals, so people assumed to be vulnerable to radicalization, extremism, are being referred to these mental health hubs. You're 23 times more likely to be referred for Islamicism than a white British for far-right extremism. But it raises this point about what happens, and this happened in the Midlands. This is a huge ethical question, by the way, that I think mental health professionals need to start being more aware, made more aware of and politicized towards. In the Midlands, the mental health hub, they start doing mental health assessments for every prevent referral. Okay, so now remember, we're seeing referrals being like youth who, again, it could be just a woman putting on a hijab, it could be a boy putting on a kufi, it could be anything. Now you're starting to do mental health assessments for all of these. And the police themselves in the report note that, isn't it interesting that so there's none in terms of mental health assessments, none, there's trauma. Here they have autism spectrum disorder, so ASD, psychosis. The focus here for me is distress and emotional behavioral dysfunction. The police themselves note this. I'm not making this point, but this is so central. The police themselves note that, isn't it interesting that the stress is so low and emotional behavioral dysfunction is so high? And most likely what's happening, according to the police, is that many youth who are being diagnosed with emotional behavioral dysfunction are actually in distress. And this is the point for all mental health professionals in this room. The jump from distress to emotional behavioral dysfunction is a political one. When we say someone is in distress, we recognize the context, the cause of it. If a youth is very upset and is acting out behaviorally, or their experiences emotionally because one of their parents passed away, we can understand the nature of that. That's what we recognize as distress, as someone can be distressed. It may have emotional behavioral dysfunction. There's other studies to sort of corroborate this. We're seeing this in these behavioral units in schools. Speak towards this idea that this person is not managing themselves correctly, or they can't manage their emotions correctly. This depoliticization of the stress, and there's this depoliticizing impulse in mental health through the process of diagnosis to say that this is that person's individual problem. It doesn't belong to the context that they're in. Right? So when we think about youth who are very upset about the genocide that they're constantly bearing witness to, and they're very angry about it, if a teacher does not recognize or see that as legitimate, then they're going to say, well, this kid is just too angry and they have to manage their anger better, right? And there's a very powerful depoliticizing impulse in psychology, which has been written about extensively, and I've written about it a lot as well in my book. I want you to hold on to this depoliticizing impulse because I have 2 minutes left for myself. And I'm going to bring it back to Palestine. Because we have an issue with anti-racism right now, right? And a big part of that distortion in anti-racism that we have in mental health is our ignorance of that depoliticizing impulse. So I emphasized already the right side of this slide. Okay, which is psychologizing has a very powerful process of depoliticizing. It's a way of removing that sort of significance of the context and individualizing it. This is, again, something that's been written about extensively. But there's also in liberal politics this erasure of cause. When we think about we think about racism, we're all anti-racist. But in being anti-racist, we're not appreciating the process of racialization, the dynamics, the reasons, the causes of why people are racialized, like increased nationalism, like national security, like gang matrix logics in policing, right? We erase we erase the causes and focus on the overt phenomena of this. And this is something that's very significant in liberal anti-racist projects, which is also very significant for the purpose of Palestine. Many people might not know this, but in 1975, the UN General Assembly, when we're speaking about apartheid, I'm going to talk about apartheid very quickly. The UN General Assembly in 1975 passed a resolution that the majority of the world agreed to, Resolution 3379, which is simply that Zionism is racism, right? And this was a UN resolution that was passed that was simply then just sort of, accepted, right? And apartheid was understood as a consequence of Zionism. So the cause of apartheid, of ethno-supremacy, of dehumanizing the Palestinian population was understood to be as a result of Zionism. This is well understood historically. Now, what happened to that resolution 3379 was that it was removed at the request of Israel for them to be able to enter into the Oslo peace process. It wasn't removed because the cause itself was disputed. It was removed out of a request for them to be able to, for them to want to engage in the process of the Oslo, the shambolic Oslo peace process, which has obviously been decimated at this point in terms of all the things that happened in that process. And what's interesting now, if you look at apartheid, is thinking about it as this sort of systemic discrimination, this excess of governance, of policies that are impacting individuals and racial groups. So now apartheid is understood as this racism without ideology. Is this simply this excess, right? And we're constantly seeing this in anti-racism in psychology as well, which speaks to my point that one thing that we're seeing is, if we take up how psychology and mental health professions can depoliticize, and we're also taking other processes, other liberal logics of taking and removing the cause, we're seeing this conflict whereby, if we understand Zionism and apartheid to be this excessive systemic discrimination, we're seeing what a lot of mental health professionals are saying, well, how do we give therapy? How can we support Palestinians? Because this idea of excessive governance, bad apples, whatever it might be, makes it amenable to a therapeutic gaze. We can actually support these individuals because they are being impacted by excess. But if you think about Zionism, if you take it as actually a cause, as a denial of collective right of self-determination, that's something that's pre-therapeutic. What these people need are actually self-determination, which then brings us to a very important point. If we understand then Zionism to be significant in the process of dehumanization inherently, as nationalism and other things that we spoke about before, then what would that mean for our EDI boards and other anti-racist practices today in the UK? So my point then to end is that actually, not only is Palestine relevant for us here and now, it speaks to actually unraveling our very practice of anti-racism in mental health professions. And we really have a muddle that we have to work through. I'm going to end like that. Thank you very much. Oh, this is my book if anybody wants to read more. I can also share it with anybody personally if anybody wants.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tarek. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm sat here with like a million different tabs open in my head, kind of processing everything you've just shared. And I can see comments in the chat, people kind of really appreciating it being an excellent workshop. So thank you. We do have time to open it up for some Q&A. And if anybody would like to ask a question, either they can pop into the chat or they want to kind of raise their hand and unmute, then we can do that. I see Omar with your hand up. Please unmute, or the IT team do their magic to unmute you, please.
Hi, thanks very much, Tarek, for a good workshop. Quite heavy going because I've experienced Islamophobia many years ago, so it was bringing back some memories. Would you say that the government haven't done enough in their ideas over the last maybe 10 years, and if maybe some politicians have encouraged Islamophobia?
I would definitely say that for all political parties involved. But again, I think it also speaks to our understanding of Islamophobia, right? If we say the government hasn't done enough, I would say, in fact, the government is also intentionally misunderstanding where Islamophobia comes from, how Muslims are racialized. I'll actually give a really good example to that. The police, when the APPG for Islamophobia gave a definition of Islamophobia as racism, okay? There were leaked documents that showed up from the police, from police chief here in the UK, that specifically said, and this was published in The Guardian, that said we cannot accept Islamophobia as a form of racism because that would make our practices racist, right? They themselves admitted that, right? So you could see that the idea then at that point is sort of for us to question the actual processes, the policies and ideologies that are affirming the process of racialization for Muslims, and to work on that. If we're truly anti-racist, we can't just expect the government to somehow be like, okay, we should push harder for racism. We actually have to understand the ways Muslims are racialized and how that's enacted in policies, and actually then work from there, right? I think any government is certainly going to want to say that they're doing everything against racism, but under Obama, the mass incarceration of Black youth increased significantly, despite anything he said. So representation politics and a lot of diversity politics, these things don't work. We need to understand actually the institutions and how they operate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. We have Christine with her hand up, please.
Can't oh, there you go. Hang on, one more. Hello.
Hi, Christine. Yeah, please,
hi.
your question.
So I have a question. Okay, so I'm a counsellor. Now, what I found is I'm really impacted by what's going on in Palestine. Oh my God. And it's just, as a counsellor working in the South, where it's mostly white people, and I know that might be controversial to say, I'm just saying how I feel it, all right? I'm not messing around with time. I can't actually, I feel like I don't have a voice. I feel like I cannot. I tried one time when we were checking in for supervision, and they said, how are you? First thing I said was, I'm so full of confused, angry feelings about what's going on in Palestine. Oh, no, don't talk about that. We don't do politics here. And I think that I find that I am holding so much, and there's nowhere for me to express, talk about, without pointing fingers about the situation, about the madness of it all. And I just kind of want to know, what are your thoughts? Have you got any suggestions? Have you contemplated that aspect of it? Because, sometimes I feel like I can't stand to hear debates on the TV about what's going on, because I just stop talking and start doing. I'm fed up with it. And I'm trying to find people that I can just talk to about it. And I just find it really distressing, to be fair. And I'm really happy to have this opportunity to even vocalize that, because I feel like I've been shut down in so many ways. Sorry, there was a bit of a rant on that question. But it's important to me because, like, we feel as well. And if we have clients that come in and have opposing values, how do we manage those if we can't talk to our supervisors?
Thank you so much for sharing, Christine. I would say rant away, and I want you to know that when you express that, I think you're expressing the thoughts and experiences of many, right? Just to let you know you're not alone. And I think
Okay.
when you're sharing that, I can tell you, I can affirm that, because my work for the last 6 months is also, a lot of my work has shifted towards understanding actually why this is happening. What does it mean? You know, it's not insignificant when they say we don't do politics. That is a political position that also speaks to the process of racialization, of who's humanized, who's dehumanized, who are we allowing to exist and not exist, who do we commemorate, who do we grieve, which all these things are very important for us as therapists, obviously. It also then speaks to, and I don't want to even talk about contradictions with Ukraine and stuff like that. I mean, we could start off with that, but we don't want to delve into there, because honestly, the dehumanization of Palestinians has long extended way past that, you know, for a long time. I just wanted to affirm for you that I think there's a lot of people who are taking this seriously. I'd be happy if there's if you can reach out to me, you know, to plug you in with other groups and people who are taking this more seriously. Where
That would be brilliant.
we could feel heard and validated. And I think we do need to, but I think I really want to hold on to that point that that's a political position when the supervisor says that, because to be frank, you know, it's untenable for any anti-racist to say that they're not taking a genocide seriously, right? Like that just doesn't make any sense. And for us, then I want to take that one level further, for us to not even approach why that's happening, because the process of how Palestinians are dehumanized is actually acutely relevant to dehumanization here in the UK as well, and across the global north. We see it in Germany, we're seeing it everywhere else. So I think we really need to affirm that. Yeah, so thank you for.
How would I reach out to you?
You can.
Is there an email somewhere?
Yeah, I could share. I think Myra can. Do you have Christine?
If we can share it, share Tarek's details. If Tarek, you're okay with that directly with Christine?
Yes,
I
perfect.
think the team can do that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Lovely.
Putting it out in chat.
Yeah. And yeah, I kind of want to reiterate that so many people in the chat then have kind of really echoed and supported what Christine has just said, and that idea that the work we do is not political. Tarek, you know my work, we know each other's work, and you know I make it really clear in my book, therapy is political. And so I'm always really concerned and worried when we talk about the actual therapeutic, and that includes not just the counselling space, but the supervision space. Any of our therapeutic spaces that become kind of gatekeeping of what can and can't be shared. And often there is a boundary around politics and what can and can't be shared in the space. I'm so mindful of the time, and I appreciate there are a few people with their hands up. And I'm sure we could kind of go on for a lot longer with this discussion, but I do absolutely want to respect Tarek's time tonight. Thank you so much for a real stimulating, but even more importantly than that, such a significant presentation, and on such current in such direct topics and themes that we are not just witnessing in the world, but have a direct experience on our own lived experiences, and equally what we are doing professionally as well. So thank you, Dr. Tarek, for coming and speaking to us and sharing your amazing work.
Thank you so much for having me. And if anybody has any more questions or they'd like to discuss this further, whatever it might be, certainly if I'm happy with Myra to share my information with anyone who'd like it. So.
Okay.
So I hope to hear from all of you, and thank you so much, Myra, and everyone at the team for inviting me. You know, I'm always honored and privileged to have a space and a voice. You know, it's not a given, I think, in this space and time. So anytime that happens is a place of gratitude, and I'd like to share that. So thank you all for having me as well.